The message arrived at 300 hours, station time, when Vigil's edge was quiet, and the stars outside the viewport looked almost peaceful. Almost. Admiral Yeva Solaris was not asleep. She hadn't slept well in 3 years, not since the last engagement at Korath's Pass, where she'd lost 42 ships and won anyway. Sleep felt like a luxury that the universe hadn't yet decided she deserved. She was standing at the edge of her private observation deck, coffee in hand, staring at the slow rotation of the outer ring when her communicator chimed with a priority white signal. Priority white meant it had bypassed every filter she'd installed. She read it once, then again. Then she set her coffee down very carefully because her hands had gone still in that particular way they did when her mind was moving faster than her body. The Galactic Conclave was inviting humanity to peace talks. 12 species, the oldest political body in the known galaxy. They were extending an olive branch to the species they had spent a decade calling the Bleeding Ones, a not-so-subtle reference to humanity's habit of winning wars at catastrophic cost to themselves, and even more catastrophic cost to whoever was foolish enough to start one. The invitation was elegant, warm even. It spoke of a new era, of mutual prosperity, of leaving behind the cold silence, that strange, tense decade of non-aggression that had followed humanity's first and only interstellar war, a conflict the Conclave still discussed in hushed tones. The Battle of Korath's Pass had ended not with a treaty, but with silence, both sides stepping back from a cliff neither had expected to find. Now apparently they wanted to talk. Solaris forwarded the message to her senior staff with a single line attached: "Assembly in 1 hour. Come awake." By dawn, or what passed for it on a deep space station, her war room was full. 12 officers stood around the holotable as the invitation rotated slowly in 3 dimensions above it. Commander Taylais, her tactical lead, was already frowning. Lieutenant Priya Chen, Signals Intelligence, was pulling up background files. And in the corner, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed, was the man Solaris trusted most and liked least, Dax Mercer, intelligence operative, professional paranoid, and almost certainly the most dangerous human in the room despite carrying no visible weapons. "They want a small delegation," said Captain Oriole, reading from the brief. "Senior diplomatic staff, 3 warships maximum for escort." "They specified the ship count," Mercer said quietly. "They did. That's unusual." "It's courteous," Oriole replied. "Those are not the same thing," Mercer said. Solaris let them talk. She was still reading the invitation, looking for the thing that was bothering her. It was too smooth, every word placed with care like furniture arranged to hide a stain in the floor. The Conclave had never in recorded galactic history initiated a diplomatic outreach. They received overtures. They granted audiences. They did not invite. That wasn't arrogance, it was simply how they operated. The Conclave was the galaxy's landlord, and landlords didn't knock on your door asking if you'd like to chat. "We'll go," Solaris said, cutting through the discussion. Everyone looked at her. "Prep 17 warships." The room went quiet. "They said 3, Oriole said carefully. "I know what they said." She finally looked up from the invitation. Her eyes were calm in that specific way that her crew had learned to read as the opposite of calm. "Tell them it's for our safety. They'll accept. They want us at that table too badly to argue over ship counts." She was right. The Conclave accepted within the hour. No pushback, no negotiation. Mercer caught her eye across the room. She could see the question in his face. "You already suspect something, don't you?" She gave him nothing, just picked her coffee back up and turned to the viewport. 17 warships. Because if she was walking into a room where every smile was practiced and every word was placed like a knife, she was going to walk in loud enough that they'd hear her coming and spend all their energy wondering why she wasn't afraid. Let them think about that. Let them sit with it. The talks were in 72 hours. That was enough time for a careful person to prepare. Yeva Solaris had never been anything but careful. Dax Mercer had a theory about peace. It was simple. Nobody offered it unless they were getting something better in return. He'd formed this theory at age 19, watching a corporate arbitration on his home station end with one side smiling and the other side slowly realizing, over the following months, that they'd signed away everything that mattered. The lawyers had called it a settlement. Mercer had called it a mugging performed with paperwork. He thought about that arbitration a lot on the 16-hour burn to the neutral meridian. He was in the lower intelligence bay, 3 decks below the bridge, surrounded by screens that most of the crew didn't have clearance to read. His desk was a disaster of half-eaten ration bars and annotated signal transcripts. He hadn't slept since the briefing. He didn't particularly want to. The conclave's invitation had been perfect. That was the problem. Every diplomatic communiqué carried fingerprints, the small imperfections of rushed translation, cultural idiom, bureaucratic hedging. The conclave's message had none of that. It read like it had been written by someone who had studied human language not to communicate, but to persuade. There was a difference, and Mercer felt it in his teeth. He pulled up everything he could find on the neutral meridian, the designated meeting point. A decommissioned relay station, technically outside any species jurisdiction, chosen by the conclave. That alone was a flag. Neutral territory was usually proposed by the party with the most to lose from a home advantage. The conclave never had the most to lose. They were the most powerful political body in the galaxy. They chose the meridian not out of fairness. They chose it because it was remote. Mercer flagged it, added it to his growing list. Then the signal came in. It was faint, buried inside a routine navigational update transmitted from one of the conclave's advanced ships already at the meridian. Priya Chen caught it first, flagged it to Mercer as an anomaly, and went back to her primary work. Mercer didn't go back to anything. He pulled the signal apart frequency by frequency, spending 4 hours on something most analysts would have dismissed as comm static. It wasn't static. It was a fragment of an encrypted handshake, the kind used not between diplomats, but between fleet commanders confirming tactical positioning. Military protocol on a diplomatic channel. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he got up and went to find Solaris. He found her on the secondary bridge, alone, running approach simulations. She looked up when he entered, read his face, and gestured to the chair across from her without a word. He laid it out: the signal, the location choice, the suspicious perfection of the invitation, the specified ship count that told them exactly how many human vessels the conclave thought it could handle. Solaris listened without interrupting. She had a gift for stillness, the kind that wasn't passive but coiled. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, tapping one finger on the arm of her chair. "You don't have proof," she said. "Not yet." "Then get it." She looked back at her simulations. "And Mercer, quickly, we're 14 hours out." He nodded and turned to leave. "And Dax," she didn't look up, "don't share this with anyone else yet. If we're wrong, I'd rather not start a war over a bad reading of comm static. And if we're right." She was quiet for a second. "Then I'd still rather not start a war. I'd rather finish one." Meanwhile, in the forward observation bay, the rest of the senior staff was watching the conclave's ceremonial fleet come into view on long-range sensors. The ships were extraordinary, vast, gilded things, built more for spectacle than speed, broadcast on every open galactic feed. Beautiful, almost theatrical. Commander Talais watched them for a long time. "They're putting on a show," she said to no one in particular. Said Chen from her station. "Question is where the audience." No one could answer for that. The ships burned through the dark, and the neutral meridian moved slowly on the forward screens and decks. Dax Mercer was tearing the signal apart, looking for the line he was almost certain He found it 4 hours later. By then, things had already started moving faster than anyone expected. The neutral marine station smelled like recycled air and old metal, something faintly floral that the advanced team had in the ventilation system. A gesture of help, perhaps an attempt to make the place feel less like what it was. A decommissioned relay was in the middle of nowhere. Chose nobody would hear anything here. Morris, the silent idiot, he filed away. Conference room had been fixed up. Long banners in the concourse 12-color circle. Table large enough to land shut lawn polished to a mirror finish. 12 seats on one side for the conclave delegates, 6 for the human delegation. Symmetry was deliberate, with the statement that this was the conclave's table, a neutral one. Solaris sat down without commenting. To the chair the moment. The alien delegates arrived with ceremony. The Volkai came first, tall, gray-skinned, with 4 upper limbs, and a reputation for being the conclave's most gifted political architects. Their lead delegate was named Seval, and he moved to his seat with the particular grace of someone who had rehearsed this entrance. He smiled at Solaris with his secondary mouth, which among the Volkai was a gesture reserved for children and subordinates. Solaris smiled back with her primary mouth, which among humans meant absolutely nothing and could therefore mean anything. The remaining 11 delegations filed in, the chamber filled with the rustle and hiss and click of a dozen different biologies settling into chairs. An aide placed a copy of the proposed treaty, elegant, leather-bound, the conclave's crest embossed in gold in front of each human delegate. Mercer, seated 2 chairs down from Solaris, didn't touch his copy. The talks began. They were, on the surface, extraordinary. The conclave's opening position was generous to the point of suspicion, territorial concessions in 3 disputed systems, trade route access that humanity had been seeking for years, formal recognition of human sovereignty across the outer reach. It was everything. Too much. The kind of offer that made experienced negotiators feel not grateful, but nauseous. Solaris's lead negotiator, a sharp civilian diplomat named Ren Vasek, handled the first hour brilliantly, probing, testing, asking the kinds of questions that seemed polite but were actually designed to find load-bearing walls in an argument. The conclave's delegates handled everything smoothly. Too smoothly. Then Seval made his mistake. It was small, the kind of thing only someone actively hunting for errors would catch. Vasek had been discussing the framework for trade agreements, laying out a hypothetical structure for how disputes might be resolved. It was exploratory language, the diplomatic equivalent of doodling. Seval responded, "That concern is addressed in Section 9, the arbitration clause." Vasek paused. "I'm sorry, which treaty are you referring to? We haven't discussed an arbitration clause." A half-second silence. "I misspoke. I meant to say that would be addressed in such a clause were one to be proposed." Smooth recovery, but a half-second too late. Mercer, who had been watching Seval's hands the entire time, saw the microscopic tightening of 2 of his 4 fingers. Not fear, recalibration. He wrote 2 words on the paper in front of him and slid it sideways to Solaris without looking at her. "He knows." Solaris read it. Her expression didn't change. She continued watching Vasek work, her posture easy, her hands folded on the table. Chen, back on the flagship, was having her own moment of discovery. She'd been running passive scans on the Conclave's ceremonial ship since arrival, standard procedure, nothing aggressive. The scans kept returning a low-level pulse emission she couldn't account for. She ran it against every civilian and diplomatic frequency in the database. Nothing matched. Then, on instinct, she ran it against the military database, the restricted one, the one that required her override code to access. She found it in under 6 seconds. It was a fleet coordination pulse, the kind used by warship formations to maintain synchronization across fold space distances. The kind that meant, "We are still here, still ready, still waiting." She flagged it to Mercer with a priority tag and one line of text. "There's a fleet in fold space. I can hear them breathing." Down in the conference chamber, the talks moved on. Vasek was asking about timelines. Seval was smiling with the wrong mouth again. The treaty document sat in the center of the table like a beautiful, expensive, perfectly constructed trap. And at the human end of the table, two people were sitting on information that changed everything, waiting, because their admiral had told them to wait, and because Yeva Solaris had not yet shown her hand. She was still listening, still watching, still 3 moves ahead of a game the Conclave thought they were winning. The galaxy had always underestimated humans. It was, at this point, becoming a pattern. The moment Mercer read Chen's message, he excused himself from the table. He said it calmly, "Apologies, a minor medical matter," the kind of excuse that required no elaboration and invited no questions. 3 of the conclave delegates watched him leave. He counted their gazes as he walked out and noted which ones tracked him longest. All 3 were Voikai. He kept his pace even until he cleared the corridor junction, then moved fast to the secured communications alcove they'd established on the station's lower level. Chen's full report was already waiting, transmitted on a tight beam through a relay they'd hidden in the station's own infrastructure during the approach, standard procedure for a human intelligence operative, deeply illegal by conclave rules, and exactly the kind of thing Mercer considered basic courtesy to himself. He read it twice. Then he pulled up the fold space coordinate data Chen had triangulated from the pulse emissions, cross-referenced it against the Meridian's local star charts, and felt something cold settle in his chest. The hidden fleet wasn't far, 22 minutes at standard jump emergence, close enough to arrive before anyone could scatter, far enough to look like deep space if you weren't specifically hunting for the pulse. He counted the emission signatures Chen had isolated. 14 distinct fleet coordination signals. Minimum 14 warships, likely more, since older vessels sometimes ran dark on coordination pulses to reduce their signature footprint. 14 ships against 17, on the surface manageable. Except the 17 human ships were escort-classed, fast, well-armed, but not built for a pitched engagement against a prepared fleet. And more critically, the target wasn't the ships. He could see the shape of it now with horrible clarity. The signing ceremony. The moment the treaty was executed, a signal would go out, a confirmation burst on the same low-frequency channel the Conclave's ships were using, and the Fold Space Fleet would jump in. All of it, right on top of them. The goal wasn't to win a battle, it was to not need one. Kill the admiral, kill the senior diplomatic staff, destroy the command ships. In the chaos that followed, the confusion, the grief, the leadership vacuum, the conclave would offer terms. Humanity, headless and reeling, would accept them. It was elegant, it was ruthless. It was, he admitted privately, good strategy. He fired an encrypted burst to Chen. "Lock down your findings. Tell no one except the admiral." Then he straightened his jacket, walked back through the station's corridors at a measured pace, and re-entered the conference chamber. Solaris looked up when he sat down. He met her eyes for exactly 1 second. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of the chin, and returned her gaze to the table. She already knew. Of course she did. He could see it in the way she'd been sitting for the past hour, perfectly still, the way she went still when she was managing information that had to be kept off her face. She'd probably had suspicions the moment Chen's first flag came through, maybe before. Vasek was talking about cultural exchange programs now, something light and forward-looking, buying time as the talks moved toward their natural endpoint, the signing. Seval was listening with an expression of warm satisfaction that Mercer now understood was not diplomatic pleasure but anticipation. The treaty document was still in the center of the table. The pen beside it was a beautiful thing, handcrafted, presented by the conclave as a gesture of goodwill, its barrel inlaid with the 12 colors of the conclave sigil. A prop in someone else's play. Mercer looked around the table. The alien delegates were composed, professional, radiating the particular calm of people who believe they have already won. The human delegates were focused, sharp, working hard. He felt a sudden, sharp swell of something, not fear, but something adjacent to it. Clarity, maybe. The kind that comes when the fog burns off and you can finally see the shape of the ground you're standing on. He leaned back very slightly in his chair and thought about the 17 human warships sitting in dock outside this station. He thought about the hidden fleet waiting in fold space. He thought about the fact that Solaris had insisted on 17 ships when 3 were suggested, and wondered, not for the first time, exactly how much she had already anticipated. A lot, probably, more than she'd told him. That was her way. Vasek was winding up toward a natural break. The session would pause, reconvene in 2 hours, and then the signing would be scheduled. The machine was moving forward. Mercer quietly, carefully, excused himself again. This time he didn't go to the calm alcove. He went to find out if Solaris had a plan, or if she'd been running one all along without telling any of them. He suspected strongly that it was the latter. Solaris was in the secondary briefing room off the main conference corridor when Mercer found her. She was alone, standing at the room's narrow viewport, arms crossed, watching the stars. A cup of cold tea sat untouched on the table behind her. She didn't turn when he entered, but she spoke immediately, which told him she'd heard his footsteps in the corridor and already knew it was him. 14 ships, she said. Minimum, fold space, roughly 22 light minutes out. He stopped walking. You already ran the numbers. Chen is thorough. I read her report 7 minutes after she filed it. She finally turned. Her expression was the same one she wore in the war room, not cold exactly, but compressed. Every unnecessary thing stripped away. What took you longer was the geometry. You wanted to understand the full shape of it before you came to me. I wanted to be certain. Were you? Yes. She nodded once. Good, so was I. She moved to the table, and for the first time he noticed what was laid out on it. Not tea, the cup was just camouflage. Beneath a slim privacy screen was a tactical display, live feed from their ship's sensors, showing the fold space coordinates in real time. She'd been working in here the whole break. The signal goes out at signing, he said. The fleet jumps in, command decapitation. Yes. We have 17 escort-class vessels against at least 14 dedicated warships. We do, she sat down, except we don't. He looked at her. She pulled up a second layer on the tactical display, and Mercer went very still. There were ships in the fold space coordinates, not the conclaves. Human ships, sleek, dark, running on minimal emissions, positioned in a dispersed intercept pattern around the conclave's hidden fleet like wolves who had found a den and settled in to wait. He counted them, 11 stealth class. 12, one is running so quiet even I almost missed it. The faintest trace of pride in her voice. Prometheus class, the classified program, 3 years of development. The conclave doesn't know they exist. We've never deployed them in a live scenario. Mercer pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. You prepositioned them before we left Vigil's Edge. I prepositioned them 6 days before we left Vigil's Edge. The moment I received the invitation and noticed it was too clean, I started moving pieces. She picked up her cold tea, looked at it, put it back down. The conclave ships have been sitting in that fold space pocket for 4 days. My ships have been sitting around them for 3. He stared at her. You've been sitting in that conference room knowing our people had the conclave's ambush fleet surrounded the entire time. Yes. And you said nothing. I needed to know how far they'd commit. I needed to see the full play, not just the opening move. She pulled up the treaty document on her screen, not the conclave's version. Her version. Clean type, different terms, humanity's language. And I needed this to be ready. He looked at the document. Read the first page. The terms were not the ones they'd been negotiating. They were harder, clearer, written by someone who understood leverage and was prepared to use it without apology. They're going to refuse this, he said. Some of them. She closed the screen. The ones who aren't implicated in the ambush will sign it within a week. They have nothing to gain from solidarity with the Volkai right now. She stood. The conclave made an error, Dax. They looked at human history, the losses we take, the costs we absorb, the wars we fight at terrible price, and they decided we were reckless, emotional. They thought our aggression was a symptom of poor judgment. It's not, he said. No, she picked up her jacket from the back of her chair. Every war we've ever fought, we fought because someone pushed us and we decided the cost of not fighting was higher than the cost of fighting. That's not recklessness. Her voice was quiet, final. That's calculation. They just couldn't read it because the math looked different from theirs. She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. I'm going to go back in there, sit down, and pick up that pen. She looked back at him over her shoulder. And then I'm going to put it down again, and everything that happens after that is going to happen very fast. What do you want me to do? Sit next to me, count Seval's fingers, tell me if they move. She walked out, he followed. The conference chamber was just ahead, warm light spilling from its open doors, the sound of diplomatic voices floating into the corridor. Mercer squared his shoulders, adjusted his collar, and walked back into the room where 12 alien species thought they had already won. He sat down. He watched Seval's hands. He waited. The second session opened with the conclave's cultural liaison presenting a short holographic piece, sweeping visuals of 12 worlds, 12 civilizations, reaching toward a shared future. It was beautiful, professionally produced, the kind of thing that took months to prepare. Mercer watched it with the same expression he gave to everything, analytical distance, faint suspicion. Solaris watched it with apparent appreciation, her eyes tracking the images, her posture open and relaxed. She was extraordinary at this, he thought. The stillness, the performance of being exactly what the room expected her to be, while the real her sat behind her eyes doing geometry. When the presentation ended, Seval stood. We reached the moment, he said, his translator emitting the words in polished standard. The moment from which a new era begins. We have spoken of trade, of territory, of recognition. All of it is here. He gestured to the treaty document glowing softly in the center of the table. Admiral Solaris, if you would do us the honor. The room arranged itself around the ceremony. Aides appeared. Someone adjusted the lighting. A Volkai delegate who had said almost nothing all day straightened slightly in his seat, a tell, Mercer thought. He filed it. Solaris rose. She moved around the table to the treaty document with the unhurried pace of someone approaching something important. She reached out. Her fingers closed around the pen, the beautiful, ceremonial, 12-colored pen. The room held its breath. Mercer watched Seval's upper right hand. The fingers were gathered slightly tight, not quite relaxed. Solaris held the pen above the signature line. 1 second, 2. Seval's fingers moved, barely, the beginning of an unconscious tightening, the micro-gesture of a man who sees what he has waited for arriving. Solaris set the pen down. The sound it made against the table was small, quiet, but it landed in that silent room like a stone dropped into still water. Before I sign, she said, I'd like to discuss the fleet you have waiting at coordinates 7, Theta 9, grid reference Delta Mark 6. No one breathed. She looked up at Seval with the expression of someone making polite conversation. 14 warships, I believe, though one of them is running an unusual emission profile, so it may be 15. Fold space, 22 light minutes from this station. She tilted her head slightly. Jump positioned for rapid emergence. Targeting solutions would be preloaded, I assume, very efficient. The silence in the room had texture now, the kind that precedes something irreversible. As Seval's translator picked up a sound he made, it rendered it, somewhat inadequately, as, "You are mistaken." "I'm not." She reached into her jacket and placed a data chip on the table. "Fleet coordination pulse logs, 3 days' worth, pulled from your ceremonial ship's emissions. The military handshake protocol. Frequency 7-7 Kessler. Used by Vaokai Hegemony Fleet Command since before I was born." She looked at him pleasantly. "Your signals people really should have used something more obscure." She turned to address the full table. "I want to be clear about something. My fleet didn't come here to start a war. I didn't come here to humiliate the Conclave. I came here genuinely to see if peace was possible." She paused. "But I came prepared for the alternative, because that is what humans do. We prepare." On the main holodisplay, the one that had just shown a beautiful vision of 12 civilizations reaching toward each other, a new feed appeared. Solaris's signals officer had been waiting for the cue. The fold space coordinates bloomed with light. Not from the Conclave's fleet jumping in, from the wreckage of it. 12 human stealth ships had opened fire at the exact moment Solaris set the pen down, a prearranged signal, sent the instant she broke the ceremony. The Conclave's hidden armada, meant to decapitate humanity's leadership in a single stroke, had instead spent 3 days slowly being surrounded and had been destroyed in less than 4 minutes. The alien delegates watched their reinforcement signals die, one by one, on the feeds behind Solaris's head. She waited until the last signal went dark. Then she reached into her jacket again and placed a different document on the table. Clean pages, black type, humanity's seal. "Shall we begin again?" she said. The chamber had become a different place. 4 minutes ago it had been a stage, dressed, lit, arranged for a performance in which humanity was the audience and the punchline simultaneously. Now it was simply a room. A metal room on a decommissioned station in the middle of empty space, full of alien diplomats watching their strategy collapse in real time on a screen behind the woman they had tried to kill. As Seval hadn't moved, Mercer respected that about him, the stillness, the refusal to visibly break even as everything he'd built broke around him. His 4 hands were flat on the table. His secondary mouth was closed. He looked like a man running complex calculations and not yet arriving at an answer that helped him. The other delegates were less composed. The Keth liaison had risen halfway out of her seat and then appeared to decide that sitting back down was politically safer. 2 conclave aides had disappeared entirely through a side door. The delegation from the Oracy Compact, oldest member species of the conclave, generally considered the moral architects of its charter, were speaking rapidly among themselves in low, clipped tones. Solaris stood at the head of the table, her document in front of her, and waited. She was not gloating. Mercer noted this because it would have been easy to gloat, and the restraint was doing more work than any speech could have. She wasn't lecturing them, wasn't listing grievances or cataloging the insult. She had simply shown them the board and was waiting to see who was still willing to play. "You prepositioned your fleet inside our deployment zone," Seval said finally. His translator rendered his voice as steady, though Mercer thought he could detect something underneath it. "That is an act of defense," Solaris said simply. "You positioned your fleet to destroy mine. I positioned mine to prevent that." She tilted her head. "I'm happy to argue legal frameworks later. Right now I'd like to know which of you knew about this, which of you were told something different, and which of you are going to have very difficult conversations with your home governments when this feed reaches them." Because the feed was going out. She'd opened the broadcast the moment she put the pen down, live transmission to every human station, every galactic news relay, every open channel the Conclave had used to broadcast their beautiful ceremonial arrival. The same audience that had watched the gilded ships arrive was now watching the feed from Fold Space, watching what was left of the ambush fleet. The RSE delegate stood. She was ancient by any species reckoning, and she moved slowly, but her voice when she spoke was clear. The Odyssey Compact, she said, had no knowledge of the tactical deployment. We were told the escort fleet was present as a security measure against third-party interference. She turned and looked directly at S. We were lied to. S. said nothing. I suggest, the Odyssey delegate continued, addressing Solaris now, that you allow those of us who were deceived to review your proposed document before making any further decisions. Of course, Solaris said, and distributed the copies. It was 6 hours before the room fully settled, 6 hours of intense, fragmented, species-by-species conversations that Mercer described afterward as watching 12 different car crashes happen simultaneously in slow motion. The Keth and the Odyssey read humanity's terms and, after consultation with their home systems, indicated they could work with the framework. The Pelosi and the Arvon delegations were reserved but not hostile. The Volcae were silent. Mercer spent those 6 hours doing what he did best, listening to the edges of conversations, watching body language, tracking who consulted with whom and in what order. By hour 4, he had a working theory of which species had known about the ambush and which had been used as cover. By hour 6, he had it mapped. In the early hours of what would later be called the Meridian Realignment, Solaris signed humanity's own document. Not all 12 conclave species signed with her that day, but 4 did, and those 4 signatures were the ones that mattered most. The ones that would quietly, inevitably, pull the others in over the following weeks. The Volcae delegation left without signing anything. They were polite about it. S. nodded to Solaris as he passed her. She nodded back. Outside, the human fleet held formation, quiet, professional, present. No victory burns, no displays. They simply sat there in the dark, the way they'd sat through the cold silence, the way they'd sat at Korath's Pass, steady, prepared, watching. Chen filed her full report from the flagship. It was 340 pages, and she delivered it in 4 hours, which was record time. Vasek drafted the diplomatic summary in plain language for broadcast, careful, factual, dry, designed to be impossible to misrepresent. And in the station's lower corridor, Mercer stood outside and breathed recycled air and thought about peace again. His theory hadn't changed. Nobody offered it unless they were getting something better. But sometimes, he thought, the better thing was real. Sometimes the math actually worked. Sometimes peace was the genuine calculation, not the trap, and the trick was in figuring out which one you were looking at before the pen touched the paper. Yeva Solaris had known. 6 days out, she'd already known, and she'd moved her pieces into position and walked into the trap anyway, because walking into a trap you can see is not walking into a trap at all. It's choosing the battlefield. Humanity had always been good at that. The feed took 11 hours to reach the outer colonies. On Vigil's edge, people gathered around every public display they could find in mess halls, docking bays, observation corridors, the cramped common rooms of residential blocks where 3 generations of a family might share 400 square feet. They watched the broadcast of the Meridian Conference in complete silence. And then, when Solaris set the pen down and the fold space feed lit up, the silence broke. Not into cheering exactly. Something more complicated, more tired. The sound of people who had spent a decade being told they were the problem, too violent, too aggressive, too expensive, too human, hearing the other side of the story. The galaxy didn't react all at once. It absorbed the information in layers, the way complex things do. The Volcae hegemony's internal collapse began within 48 hours. The feed had been public. The evidence was clean. 3 of their High Council members resigned before the full story was out. By the end of the week, the government that had architected the Meridian trap was in full political crisis. Not because the plan had failed, but because the evidence of it was now sitting in the archives of every news relay in the known galaxy, permanent and accessible and deeply unflattering. The other species processed it differently. The Keth and Oracy, who had been used as unwitting cover, were furious in the particular way of people who have been made to look complicit in something they genuinely opposed. Both governments issued formal statements within hours of the feed reaching them. Both statements, notably, were addressed not to the Vaokai, but to humanity, careful, slightly stiff acknowledgments that amounted to the nearest diplomatic equivalent of "we're sorry" and also "we're embarrassed." Solaris received them aboard her flagship on the transit back to Vigil's Edge. She read both statements, forwarded them to her diplomatic staff with minimal annotation, and then went to sleep for 14 hours, which everyone around her quietly considered both reasonable and overdue. Mercer filed his after-action report and then spent 3 days not filing anything, which he considered his right after being awake for approximately 60 continuous hours at various points in the preceding week. His report was thorough, methodical, and included a section called "What I Would Have Done Differently" that was entirely blank. Priya Chen received, without fanfare, a transfer to the research posting she had applied for twice and been denied twice. The denial letter cited insufficient seniority. The approval letter cited nothing, it simply said yes, reporting date, welcome aboard. She read it in the signals bay and then went back to her work, because that was what Chen did. 3 weeks after the Meridian realignment, the Pelosi Directorate requested a bilateral meeting with Humanity's Diplomatic Corps. Private. No conclave involvement. The proposed agenda included trade access and a mutual defense clause. The week after that, the Arvon sent a similar request. The week after that, 2 more species. They came quietly, separately, carefully, making sure the others didn't know, the way anyone does when they're reconsidering an old alliance and not yet ready to say so publicly. Solaris's diplomatic staff handled them one at a time. Vasek proved tireless at this work, finding the language that made the terms feel fair while keeping them firmly in humanity's interest. He was gifted, Mercer thought. He could make hard things sound reasonable, and the best diplomats were the ones who could do that without lying. The conclave as a structure didn't collapse. It was too old and too embedded in galactic infrastructure to simply dissolve over one spectacular failure. But it changed. The center of gravity shifted. Species that had deferred to the Vaokai for a century began looking elsewhere, doing private math about where power actually sat now. The galaxy was recalibrating, slowly and irreversibly, the way it only does when something foundational has been revealed. What had been revealed was simple but significant. Humanity had known, had anticipated, had prepared quietly, thoroughly in the dark without telling anyone, and when the moment came had executed everything with precision and minimal force and zero panic. They hadn't destroyed the conclave. They hadn't taken territory. They hadn't broadcast triumphant speeches or threatened reprisals. They had simply shown that they could not be surprised, could not be decapitated, could not be removed from the board by a clever move and a pretty ceremony. That, more than the fold space battle, more than the treaty, more than anything Solaris had said in the conference chamber, that was what the galaxy was now sitting with. Solaris gave one press interview, 2 weeks after returning to Vigil's Edge. She was asked, by a journalist from the Outer Reach Independent, whether she had always intended to let the conclave's plan advance as far as it did. She thought about the question. "I needed them committed," she said. "Half measures don't hold in court and they don't hold in history. If I'd shown them my hand early, they would have called it a misunderstanding, and we'd have been back here in 5 years doing it again." She paused. "I needed them to sit down at that table knowing exactly what they were there to do, and I needed everyone watching to see it." "Were you ever afraid?" the journalist asked. Another pause, longer this time. "I was afraid every day of the 6 days before we left," she said. "After that I was busy." She almost smiled. "There's a difference." The interview aired across 300 stations. The last line became, somewhat to Solaris's evident annoyance, a quote that appeared on recruiting posters for the next decade. In the officers' mess of Vigil's Edge, late on a quiet evening, Mercer sat across from Chen, who was 3 days from her transfer and had agreed to one drink before she shipped out. They talked about the Meridian for a while, the way you talk about something after the adrenaline has gone and only the texture of it remains. "What do you think they expected?" Chen asked, "when they sent that invitation?" Mercer considered it. "I think they expected us to be grateful," he said, "for being noticed, for being included." He turned his glass slowly on the table. "I think they thought we were still the species from 50 years ago, before Korath, before the cold silence." He shook his head. "They weren't paying attention." Chen looked at her drink. "We changed." "We've always been like this," Mercer said. "They just didn't look close enough to see it." Outside the viewport, the stars held steady. The station turned its slow rotation. On the distant feeds, the galactic diplomatic machine churned forward, species talking to species, carefully, cautiously, recalibrating. Humanity sat at the table, not because someone had finally decided they deserved a seat, because they had never needed permission to pull up a chair. They had just been waiting for everyone else to figure that out.